What happens when a gang of criminals targets a black woman at a cafe, thinking she's an easy target to rob, only to find out that she's waiting on her Navy SEAL father? Watch as the seasoned veteran fights back against the gang, saving his daughter and risking it all to keep her safe. The city cafe hummed with its usual late afternoon buzz, the gentle murmur of voices mixing with the clinking of cups. Emma Davis sat outside, the warm sun soaking into her skin as she relaxed with her cappuccino. The swirl of foam in her cup caught the light, but she wasn't paying much attention to it. Instead, she tapped away on her phone, scrolling through emails. A message from her boss made her frown, and she sighed, her fingers scrolling up and down, only half aware of the activity around her. Emma had always found solace in places like this, where the noise of the city blurred into a kind of peaceful hum. It was the perfect spot to relax before heading back to the grind of her work week. She glanced up for a moment, taking in the lively scene, the families enjoying their time, the couples lost in their conversations. It was a typical afternoon in the city, a brief escape from the usual chaos that filled her life. She didn't notice the three men at first. They had blended into the background, their laughter low and persistent, cutting through the chatter around them. But when their voices grew louder and closer, Emma glanced up. Three men strolled down the sidewalk, their movements relaxed but deliberate. The leader, tall and wiry with a sharp grin, scanned the street with keen eyes, while his two companions, one blonde with a scar on his jaw, the other stocky and wearing a hoodie, followed close behind. Emma quickly glanced back down at her phone, dismissing the intrusion. It was just another group of people passing by, she reasoned. There was no need to worry. The cafe was full of people, and she wasn't alone. Still, a small, uneasy feeling settled in her stomach as she tapped away, as if something was about to shift. The scraping sound of a chair pulling back snapped her attention away from her phone. She looked up again, surprised to see the trio had stopped at her table. The tall one with the smirk had already pulled out a chair and was sliding into it, as though it were his right to do so. "Nice day, isn't it?" he said casually, almost friendly, though the way his eyes assessed her made Emma's pulse quicken. She forced a polite smile, nodding faintly, and hoped they would leave her alone. But they didn't. The blonde one, Ryan, laughed and said, "Man, don't ask her. She doesn't care." Emma flinched at the words, feeling them more than she wanted to. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the barista inside the cafe, but no one seemed to notice her discomfort. The world continued on as if nothing was wrong. The tall man, Connor, leaned back in his chair, smirking as his gaze moved from her to the empty seats at the table. "Relax," he said with a dismissive wave. "We're just being friendly, right?" Emma tried to remain calm, the knot in her stomach tightening. She clenched her hands around her coffee cup, not sure what to do next. The sense of unease had transformed into something more, something dangerous. She forced herself to speak, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "I'm just here for coffee," she said, hoping the simplicity of the statement would end the conversation. Connor raised an eyebrow and leaned forward. "Coffee, huh?" His grin widened. "Seems like you've got a fancy purse for just a coffee run." Ryan, the blonde one, leaned over the table, pointing to her purse. "Bet she's got all kinds of goodies in there, huh?" Emma instinctively pulled her bag closer, her heart racing. "It's just a purse," she said, her voice shaking despite herself. Ryan chuckled, leaning back again. "Relax, no need to get jumpy." The third man, Paul, let out a snicker, his voice rough. "She's acting like we're gonna rob her or something." The words made Emma's stomach drop. She glanced around again, desperately searching for someone to help, but no one was looking in her direction. They were all too wrapped up in their own worlds. The cafe patrons had no idea what was happening at the table just a few feet away. Connor leaned forward, his posture becoming more threatening. "You seem nervous," he said, his voice dropping slightly, as though savoring the power he had over her. Emma's stomach twisted. She hadn't said a word about being nervous. They had picked up on her anxiety, and now they were playing with it. "I'm not nervous," she replied quickly, trying to push back against the tremor in her voice. But the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. Connor smiled, and the other two men joined in, the air growing thick with tension. Emma's eyes darted around the patio, but it felt like no one cared. She reached for her coffee, forcing herself to take a sip. The warm liquid did nothing to ease the cold panic that had gripped her chest. The blonde man, Ryan, suddenly reached forward, tapping the untouched cup in front of her. "Still hasn't touched her drink. What's the matter? Not thirsty?" Emma's fingers tightened around the handle of her cup, but she didn't respond. She just pushed it away slightly, a small attempt to reclaim some control. The tension was palpable now. Connor's eyes had shifted from playful to calculating, as though he were appraising something he intended to take. "What's in the bag?" he asked, a dangerous edge creeping into his voice. "Nothing important," Emma replied, clutching it tighter. She could feel her heart beating in her throat, but she didn't want to show them how frightened she really was. "Relax," Ryan said, his tone mockingly soothing. "We're just curious." Emma tried to remain calm, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, but it was too late. The sense of danger had grown too large to ignore, and she knew they were just toying with her. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough to draw the attention of a couple sitting nearby. They glanced over, but quickly looked away, lost in their own conversation. The world around her felt distant, like she was trapped in her own private nightmare. Connor's smirk twisted into something colder, and he reached toward her purse. "Don't touch my things," Emma said loudly, surprising herself. Her voice caught the attention of a few nearby tables, but none of them seemed to care enough to intervene. "Feisty," Connor remarked, his grin returning. "I like that." The words were barely out of his mouth when Paul, the stockier one, shoved her shoulder lightly, pushing her back in her seat. "Sit down, sweetheart. You're making a scene." Emma's heart was racing. She was trapped. The cafe had become a stage for something that no one seemed to notice, or perhaps no one cared enough to stop. Emma's breath quickened as Connor and his friends closed in on her. She was boxed in, no way out. The cafe around her had become nothing more than a distant hum. Her mind raced, looking for a way to escape. But the walls felt like they were closing in, and her body felt heavy, like it was stuck in place. "Relax, sweetheart," Connor said again, his voice mocking. "We're not gonna bite." But the look in his eyes, the hunger there, told Emma otherwise. The words felt like a trap, each one tightening the noose around her. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. She couldn't make a scene. What if they decided to hurt her if she did? Ryan leaned over the table, getting closer to her face. His breath was warm and smelled faintly of alcohol. "What's the matter? You scared?" Emma tried to push the fear down, but it was like a wave crashing over her, drowning her. She wanted to shout, to fight back, but she had no idea who would help. No one seemed to care. No one seemed to notice. She wanted to believe someone would step in, but she had no faith that anyone would. "I'm not scared," Emma said, forcing the words out, even though her hands were trembling. She had to stand firm, had to show them she wasn't an easy target. She had to try. Connor's smirk deepened as he shifted in his chair, letting his eyes sweep across her, appraising her as if she were just another thing to possess. "You don't look like you belong here, do you? What brings you to this side of town?" His words dripped with mockery. Emma froze, uncertain how to respond. Her eyes shifted toward the door to the cafe, hoping for a waiter or someone to notice the growing tension, but it felt like time was slowing down. No one was coming. No one even seemed to notice. The world outside continued, people eating, laughing, while she sat here, trapped. "I'm just here for coffee," Emma said again, her voice lower now, quieter. She wished she could disappear, wished that she wasn't stuck in this nightmare of her own making. "Coffee, huh?" Connor repeated, his eyes narrowing as if he didn't believe her. He leaned in closer, closer than he needed to, and Emma's pulse raced as she felt his gaze roam over her. "That's a nice purse for just a coffee run." Ryan let out a chuckle, leaning forward as well, his eyes fixed on her bag. "What's in there, huh? Bet it's something valuable, huh? Fancy purse for a fancy lady?" Emma's body stiffened, instinctively clutching her purse even tighter. It was just a bag, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing keeping her safe, the only thing she could protect. "It's just a purse," she said again, trying to force her voice steady. "It's not worth anything." Relax, Ryan said, still smirking. He leaned back in his chair again, but his eyes never left her. We're just curious. No harm in that, right? Emma swallowed hard, trying to control the tremble in her voice. Please, just leave me alone. Her plea hung in the air, but they didn't move. The tension was thick, suffocating. Connor tilted his head, his smile widening as if he were enjoying the game he was playing. I think she's nervous, guys, he said with a cold laugh. Look at her shaking. Maybe she's hiding something. Maybe it's a lot more than just a purse. Emma felt the weight of his words press against her chest like a vice. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears, the rapid pulse that echoed through her. The panic was overwhelming, but she fought it down. She couldn't show them weakness. She couldn't show them fear. I'm not hiding anything, Emma said, her voice stronger this time, though it was still laced with uncertainty. Just leave me alone. But Connor wasn't done. He stood up from his chair, towering over her now. You seem nervous, sweetheart, he said again, his voice cold. Are you sure you're not hiding something? He reached out to touch the strap of her purse, the one thing Emma had held on to for some sense of safety. Don't touch my things, Emma snapped, her voice sharper than she expected. She jerked the purse back, instinctively pulling it close to her body. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. Connor's eyes flashed with irritation, and for a moment, Emma thought she might have provoked him. But then his smirk returned, cold and calculating. Feisty, he said, as if that made him enjoy this even more. I like that. Paul, the stockier of the three, laughed, a harsh sound that made Emma's skin crawl. She's got some fight in her, he sneered. Maybe we should stick around for a little longer. Emma's stomach twisted in knots, her pulse hammering in her chest. She felt the sweat on her palms, the way her body wanted to flee but couldn't. The world around her was still oblivious to the danger closing in. The other patrons, the groups of friends, the couples, none of them noticed that she was in trouble. Leave me alone, Emma said again, her voice shaking despite her resolve. She couldn't take it anymore. She wanted to scream, but the fear kept her from doing anything but speak in a broken, trembling voice. Leave you alone? Connor repeated, as if he was amused by her desperation. We're just getting started, sweetheart. Emma's breath hitched in her throat. She wanted to fight back, but she knew she wasn't strong enough. She knew that if she tried to run, they would catch her. If she screamed, they might hurt her. But she couldn't just sit there and do nothing. As if on cue, the two men, Ryan and Paul, moved to flank her. They blocked the exits, cutting off any chance of escape. Connor stood up from his chair, towering over her, his movements deliberate. Without warning, Connor reached out and grabbed her purse from her lap. Emma gasped, her hands flying out to stop him, but he was too quick. Give it back, she cried, her voice now loud enough to draw the attention of a few people at nearby tables. But no one stepped in. No one said a word. Calm down, Connor said, laughing as he yanked the purse away from her. We're just having a look. No need to get upset. Emma felt tears sting her eyes, humiliation and anger mixing within her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her instincts told her it would only make things worse. Please, she whispered, her voice trembling, just take the money and leave. Connor tossed the purse to Paul, who rummaged through it with a grin. Don't worry, sweetheart, he said. We'll be gone soon enough. He pulled out Emma's wallet and waved it in front of her face. Looks like somebody's doing all right for herself, he jeered. The words hit Emma like a slap. Her stomach twisted, and she could feel the tears stinging her eyes again. But she refused to let them fall. She wanted to scream at them, wanted to fight back with everything she had. But she was alone, and they were stronger. She had nothing left to do but watch as they walked away, taking her belongings with them, leaving her humiliated and powerless. The cafe seemed to return to normal after Connor and his friends walked away, but Emma could still feel the sting of their presence lingering in the air. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the empty chair in front of her, still shaken by the confrontation. The world had returned to its usual rhythm, the soft chatter of nearby tables filling the space, but Emma felt like she was trapped in a silent, broken bubble. She reached for her phone, hoping to call the police, but her fingers trembled too much to dial. What was the point? They were already gone, and there was nothing anyone could do to undo what had just happened. As the tears threatened to spill, a familiar voice snapped her out of her daze. "Emma?" She looked up, and her heart skipped a beat. Standing just a few feet away, with his tall, broad frame filling the doorway of the cafe, was her father, Jack Davis. Emma's breath caught in her throat as a mix of emotions flooded her. Relief, fear, shame. Her dad had always been her protector, the one person she could rely on. But the look on his face told her that he had already seen what had happened. He knew something was wrong. "Are you okay?" Jack's voice was calm but firm, his eyes scanning the area as if assessing the situation. His gaze flicked from her face to the empty chairs around her, and he saw the remnants of her coffee untouched on the table. He saw it all, and in the steady, unshakable way of a man who had seen far worse, he didn't hesitate. "What happened?" Emma's breath hitched as she tried to gather herself. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She wanted to tell him everything, but she didn't want to disappoint him. She didn't want him to see her like this, vulnerable and weak. "They took my purse," Emma whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady, "and my bracelet." Her hands trembled as she clasped them together in her lap, fighting to hold back the tears. Jack's expression shifted instantly. His eyes darkened with a fury that Emma had seen before, only in the most extreme of circumstances. He wasn't angry with her, though. He was angry for her, angry at what had been done to his daughter. She could see the protective instinct flashing in his eyes. "Stay here," Jack said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll take care of this." "Dad, please don't," Emma protested, standing up quickly. She reached out to stop him, her voice breaking. "It's not worth it. Please, just let it go." But Jack was already moving toward the door of the cafe, his posture determined. His broad shoulders shifted with every step, exuding the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of military training. Emma had seen that walk before, the way her father moved when he was about to take control of a situation, the way he had walked into battle. "Dad!" Emma called after him, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and uncertainty. But he didn't turn around. Jack stepped out onto the sidewalk, his gaze locking onto the three men who were still walking away down the street, laughing among themselves. Emma's stomach churned as she watched her father's figure approach them, his steps deliberate and measured. "Hey!" Jack's voice rang out, firm and commanding, cutting through the noise of the busy street. His voice carried an authority that made the three men stop in their tracks. They turned around, their expressions changing from casual amusement to wariness as they saw who was standing before them. Connor, the tall leader, smirked, but there was something uncertain in his eyes now. Jack's presence, his calm confidence, seemed to have an effect on them. "Well, look who decided to join the party," Connor said, his voice dripping with mock amusement. But even he couldn't hide the flicker of doubt that flashed across his face. "The cavalry's here, huh?" Jack stood tall, his posture unyielding as he locked eyes with Connor. The two men were staring each other down, and Emma felt a lump form in her throat as she realized how much her father had changed since his military days. There was no hesitation in him now, just a clear, unflinching resolve. "Give me back what you took," Jack said quietly, his voice laced with an icy calm that sent a chill through the air. Connor raised an eyebrow, feigning disbelief. "Took?" he said, glancing at his friends with a sarcastic grin. "We didn't take anything, old man." Jack's jaw tightened, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous. "Don't lie to me. My daughter told me everything. Give it back." Ryan, the blonde one, chuckled nervously. "Looks like Daddy's here to save the day." He glanced at his friends, clearly unsure of how to respond to Jack's unflappable presence. "Yeah," Paul, the stocky man, sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. "What are you going to do about it, Grandpa?" Jack's eyes narrowed, and his stance never wavered. "You've got one chance to do the right thing," he said, his tone colder now, each word weighted with authority. "Hand over what you took and walk away. Now." The three men hesitated, but their bravado didn't fully crumble. Connor took a step forward, his grin widening, but Jack didn't flinch. The tension in the air was palpable, and Emma felt the knot in her stomach grow tighter as she watched her father prepare to take action. "And what if we don't?" Connor asked, his voice tinged with mockery, as if daring Jack to make the next move. Jack's eyes never left Connor's. "Then you'll find out," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. For a moment, there was silence. The surrounding street seemed to fall away as everyone held their breath, waiting for something to happen. The air crackled with tension, and Emma's heart beat so loudly in her chest that she thought everyone could hear it. The three men were sizing Jack up, unsure of what to do next. Then Ryan smirked, his gaze flicking over to Paul. "I think this old man wants to play hero," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Jack didn't say a word. Instead, he stepped forward, his movements calculated and swift, like a trained soldier preparing for battle. And with that, the fight began. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. What had started as a quiet exchange of words suddenly erupted into an all-out confrontation. Jack, calm and composed as ever, had made his intentions clear. He wasn't about to let these men get away with what they had done. His presence alone was enough to unsettle them. But as he moved toward them, it became evident that he wasn't simply standing up to them for show. He was ready to fight. Connor, trying to maintain his bravado, was the first to make a move. With a quick motion, he swung a wild punch at Jack's face. But Jack was faster. Years of Navy SEAL training had honed his reflexes to perfection. He sidestepped the blow effortlessly, his eyes locked on Connor's, assessing the threat. Jack's counterattack was immediate. He lashed out with a quick jab to Connor's side, sending the man stumbling back, gasping for breath. The surprise of the attack knocked the smug grin off Connor's face. But before he could recover, Jack was already moving, his body fluid and precise as he closed the distance between them. Ryan and Paul, seeing their leader falter, moved in, but they were too late. Jack was in motion, his movements sharp and purposeful, taking them by surprise at every turn. Ryan, trying to play tough, lunged at Jack from the side, aiming for a heavy blow to the ribs. Jack, however, was already one step ahead. With a swift movement, he ducked under Ryan's punch, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back with a force that made Ryan yelp in pain. The blond man staggered forward, but Jack didn't release him. Instead, he pushed him into Paul, who had been trying to flank Jack from behind. The two men collided, stumbling, and Jack used that moment of chaos to his advantage. His sharp gaze flicked back to Connor, who was recovering but still visibly shaken by the force of Jack's initial strike. "Get up!" Connor growled, his voice hoarse, but there was a hint of desperation behind his words. "Take him down!" Paul, now on his feet, rushed forward, throwing a wide punch aimed at Jack's head. But Jack was already moving, sidestepping the blow with ease. As Paul's fist passed by him, Jack grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it violently. There was a sickening crack as Paul cried out, dropping to his knee, clutching his injured arm. By now, the fight had drawn the attention of several people on the street. A few bystanders stood at a distance, unsure whether to intervene, but none of them seemed to want to get involved. The café had fallen silent, the once lively chatter now replaced by the sounds of the fight, the heavy thuds of punches landing, the grunts of men in pain, and the scraping of chairs as they tipped over in the chaos. Emma, watching the fight unfold from where she had been standing, felt a mix of awe and terror. Her father moved like a force of nature, dismantling the men one by one, each strike calculated and precise. She had never seen him like this before. But then again, she had never been in a situation like this before. Her heart was racing, her palms sweating as she gripped the edge of the table. Jack was still in control, though his movements were beginning to take a toll. The fight was far from over. Connor, still nursing the pain from Jack's earlier blow, growled as he wiped the blood from his mouth and reached into his jacket. Emma's eyes widened as she saw him pull out a knife. "Stay back, Emma," Jack barked, his voice low and deadly as he saw the glint of the blade. But Emma, frozen in place, didn't even hear him. Her gaze was fixed on the weapon in Connor's hand, her breath catching in her throat. Connor, emboldened by the knife, rushed at Jack with a snarl, slashing it toward him in a wild arc. But Jack was already moving. His training kicked in, and he sidestepped the attack with ease, grabbing Connor's wrist in midair. With a swift, fluid motion, Jack twisted Connor's arm, forcing him to drop the knife. It clattered to the ground, the metal glinting as it bounced against the pavement. Ryan, still struggling to recover from Jack's earlier move, lunged again, trying to catch him off guard. But Jack had already taken control of the situation. He pivoted, grabbing Ryan by the collar and lifting him off the ground with surprising strength. Ryan gasped for air, his feet dangling as Jack held him in place, his eyes blazing with fury. "Enough," Jack said, his voice calm but filled with an undeniable authority. "You had your chance. Now you'll regret it." With a final push, Jack tossed Ryan aside, sending him crashing into the corner of a nearby table. He groaned as he crumpled to the ground, the fight drained from him. Jack turned back to Connor, whose bravado was now completely gone, replaced by a flicker of fear. The knife lay discarded on the ground between them, and Connor's confidence had evaporated. But the fight wasn't quite over yet. Paul, still clutching his arm, staggered to his feet, his face twisted in a grimace of pain. He tried to make a run for it, but Jack was already there, his movements swift and sure. With a quick motion, Jack reached out, grabbing Paul by the collar and lifting him off the ground as well. "Not so fast," Jack said, his voice low and unyielding. "You're not going anywhere." Paul tried to struggle, but Jack's grip was like iron. With a powerful shove, Jack slammed Paul into a nearby table, sending it crashing to the floor. Paul groaned in pain but didn't have the strength to resist anymore. Emma watched as the three men lay sprawled across the ground, beaten and broken. Her heart was still racing in her chest, and her hands were shaking, but she couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Her father was a force to be reckoned with, and in that moment, he had protected her, kept her safe. But she couldn't shake the feeling of how close she had come to losing everything. "Stay here," Jack said again, his voice softer now as he looked over at Emma, his eyes filled with concern. "I'll make sure they don't cause any more trouble." Emma nodded, her voice thick with emotion as she whispered, "Thank you, Dad." Jack turned back to the men on the ground, his gaze hardening once more as he called out to them, "You've made a mistake today, and now you'll have to answer for it." The fight had barely begun to slow when the first sirens were heard in the distance, growing louder as they approached. The sound was a reminder that the world outside the chaos was still moving. But inside this little corner of the cafe, time seemed to freeze. Jack stood over the three men, his fists clenched, his chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of a man who had just exerted the kind of control that only years of training could provide. The three men, Connor, Ryan, and Paul, were sprawled on the ground, each nursing injuries that Jack had delivered with calculated precision. Their pride was broken, their confidence shattered. Connor, the leader, had been the first to crumble, his knife now discarded, his attempts to intimidate Jack no longer a threat. Ryan, once brash and cocky, was groaning on the ground, clutching his ribs where Jack had struck him. Paul, who had tried to make a quick escape, was on his knees, clutching his arm, a silent acknowledgement of how quickly the fight had turned in Jack's favor. But Jack wasn't done. The sirens were close now, the wail of law enforcement echoing down the street. Jack knew they would arrive soon, and he needed to make sure these men couldn't slip away. His military instincts kicked in again as he moved quickly to secure the area, his eyes never leaving the three of them. "Stay where you are," Jack barked at them, his voice firm, his stance unyielding. "You're not going anywhere." Connor, struggling to get to his feet, let out a snarl. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man," he spat, wiping the blood from his lip. "We'll make sure you regret this." Jack's gaze remained steady, unwavering. He wasn't intimidated by threats, especially not from men like these. He had dealt with worse, far worse, in his years of service. These men were nothing but a blip in his life, a nuisance he'd already dealt with. "You think you can just walk away after what you did?" Jack's voice was low, dangerous, carrying the weight of authority he had earned over years of military service. "You targeted my daughter, and for that, you'll pay." Connor's jaw tightened, his earlier bravado faltering for a moment. He glanced at his friends, but Ryan and Paul were in no position to help. The fight had taken the wind out of their sails, leaving them groaning and struggling to sit up. Connor's expression shifted from anger to something darker, fear, but Jack wasn't done yet. With a swift motion, Jack turned to Emma, who was still standing near the table, frozen in place. Her wide eyes were locked on her father, a mixture of awe and worry in her gaze. "Emma, stay back," Jack called, his voice soft but firm. Let the police handle it now. Emma hesitated for a moment, but she could see the quiet authority in her father's eyes, the same look he had worn when he had been in the field. She nodded slowly, taking a step back, though her heart still raced in her chest. She had never been this close to real danger before, and the sight of her father handling it so effortlessly was both reassuring and unnerving. He was a force, a protector, but it also made her realize how easily things could have gone wrong. As Jack moved toward the group of men again, his gaze never wavering, the sound of police vehicles grew louder. The sirens were so close now that they drowned out all other noise, and yet Jack's focus remained on the three men who had dared to lay hands on his daughter. Connor's face twisted into a sneer. "You're just a washed-up soldier, old man," he spat. "You think you can stop us? You're outnumbered. We're not scared of you." Jack's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenching in response to Connor's taunts. But his next move was deliberate, calm, and precise. He turned his attention back to Ryan and Paul, who were still struggling to regain their composure. "Paul," Jack called, his voice steady, not showing any sign of exertion. "You want to make a deal?" Paul, who had been holding his injured arm, looked up, his eyes filled with both fear and desperation. He wasn't as tough as he had pretended to be. I don't know what you're talking about," Paul muttered, his voice weak. Jack's gaze was unrelenting. "You've got a choice, Paul. Either you help me get them to take responsibility for what they've done, or I'll make sure the cops know exactly what happened here." His words were cold, precise, and Paul's gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders slumping as the reality of his situation set in. Jack moved toward Connor, who was still standing, barely. The leader of the group was clearly reeling from the sudden shift in power. His earlier swagger was gone, replaced by a simmering frustration and fear. Jack reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and hit the emergency button. The police were almost here, but it wouldn't hurt to make sure they understood the severity of the situation. "I'm not done with you yet," Jack said to Connor, his voice low but resolute. "Not until you understand exactly who you're messing with." Connor took a step back, his eyes darting around as though looking for a way out. He didn't find one. Jack's presence alone had the effect of pushing him further into the corner. And just when it seemed like Connor might try to run, his bravado slipping, his knees weakening, he froze. The flashing lights of police cars came into view, illuminating the street with their bright red and blue hue. The police had arrived. Jack stepped back slightly, letting the officers take over. But he didn't let his guard down. Not yet. Not until these men were in custody and the situation was resolved. The officers quickly moved into position, handcuffing the three criminals and pushing them toward the waiting squad cars. There were murmurs of surprise from the onlookers, some applauding Jack's intervention, others simply watching in awe. Emma, still standing near the table, felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Her father had handled everything with such ease, as though he were simply carrying out another mission, another task in his long list of responsibilities. But for Emma, this had been personal. This was her world, her safety that had been threatened, and it had taken her father's intervention to make it right. "Are you okay?" Jack asked again, his voice softer this time as he approached her. Emma nodded, her throat tight as she tried to hold back the emotions that had built up inside of her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice wavering slightly. Jack looked at her, his expression softening for just a moment before it hardened again as he looked toward the police officers, who were now talking to the criminals. "This isn't over yet," he murmured, "but it's a start." As the men were led away, the sense of closure Emma had hoped for slowly started to sink in. It wasn't over, not completely, but for now they were safe, and that was all that mattered. The chaotic scene outside the cafe began to settle as the police officers took control. The three men who had terrorized Emma were now in handcuffs, their faces bruised and their bodies limp as they were escorted toward the waiting squad cars. The flashing lights of the police vehicles cast long shadows across the sidewalk, cutting through the tension that still hung in the air. Emma remained rooted to the spot, her hands trembling slightly as she watched her father. Jack was calm, his posture rigid and his gaze sharp, as he spoke with the officers, offering his account of what had happened. He was always so composed in moments of crisis, so unshakable, and Emma couldn't help but feel a strange mix of awe and gratitude. But beneath the relief, there was something else, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The fear, the anxiety that had gripped her so tightly, still lingered in her chest. She had never felt so vulnerable in her life, so helpless in the face of danger. Even with her father there, even with the situation resolved, she couldn't shake the feeling that things could have gone so much worse. She glanced toward the police officers, who were now questioning the criminals. She could see the smug, defiant expressions on their faces even as they were being led away. They hadn't been broken, not yet. Emma knew that the authorities would deal with them, but the reality of what had happened, the violation, the fear, still clung to her. Her gaze shifted back to Jack. He was speaking to one of the officers now, his voice steady but firm as he provided additional details. Emma couldn't hear the conversation, but she didn't need to. She knew what it was about. Jack was doing what he always did, taking charge, making sure everything was in order. But this time, it was personal. This time, it was her he had been protecting. When Jack turned toward her, his eyes softened, the steely determination that had driven him in the confrontation giving way to a gentler concern. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low but filled with genuine care. Emma nodded slowly, though the words felt empty. "I'm okay," she said, but she didn't feel okay. She didn't feel like herself. The events of the past hour had shaken her to her core, and the weight of everything was just starting to sink in. Jack stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's over now. You're safe." She looked up at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. He was right. It was over for now, but the sense of unease still gnawed at her. "I know," she said quietly, "but it was so close. I never thought it would happen to me." Jack's gaze softened, and he gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "That's the thing about life, Em. You never know when things are going to take a turn. All you can do is handle what comes your way, and you've got the right person by your side." Emma gave him a small, shaky smile. She wanted to believe him, to feel the weight of his words sinking in. But the fear she had felt was still fresh, still alive in her chest. It was hard to ignore. The two of them stood in silence for a moment, watching as the officers finished their work. Emma felt an overwhelming sense of relief as the criminals were loaded into the back of the squad cars, their faces now expressions of defeat. They had lost, and there was no escaping the consequences of their actions. But even as she saw them driven away, she couldn't help but wonder, how many others like them were out there? The cafe patrons were beginning to resume their activities, as though nothing had happened. The noise of conversations filled the air again, and the normal rhythm of the world resumed. But Emma knew her world would never be the same. The sense of safety she had once taken for granted had been shattered in an instant, and it was going to take time to piece everything back together. Jack seemed to sense the change in her. He didn't say anything, but there was a look in his eyes, one that told Emma he understood more than she was letting on. His military training had taught him to read people, to understand what they were going through, and Emma knew he could see the turmoil she was trying to hide. "You'll be okay, Em," he said softly. "It's going to take time, but you'll be all right. We'll make sure of it." Emma forced a breath out, nodding again, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. She didn't know what the future held, and the uncertainty was hard to bear. But having her father by her side made all the difference. He had kept her safe today, and in the moment of crisis, that was all that mattered. As the police cars drove away, Jack turned toward the cafe, his voice steady as he spoke again. "Let's head back home. I think we've had enough excitement for one day." Emma smiled faintly, her heart still heavy but grateful for her father's presence. "Sounds like a plan." Later that evening back at home, the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed to weigh heavily after a storm. Emma sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, trying to relax. She could still hear the echoes of the confrontation, the voices of the men, the sounds of fists meeting flesh. The world outside had returned to normal, but inside her mind, the chaos hadn't quite settled yet. Jack had stepped into the kitchen to make dinner, his movements calm and measured, just as always. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something had been taken from her today that she wasn't sure she could get back. It wasn't just the purse or the bracelet, or the fear of what might have happened. It was the realization that the world she had once known, where she could feel safe and secure, was no longer as certain as she had believed. As Jack entered the living room, he gave her a smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Dinner's ready. You should eat something." Emma nodded but didn't move. Her mind was elsewhere, racing through the events of the day, trying to process it all. She wanted to feel like herself again, but she wasn't sure how to get back to that place. "I will," she said quietly. "Just not hungry right now." Jack studied her for a moment, his eyes softening with concern. He didn't push her, but he didn't leave either. Instead, he sat down beside her, his presence a steady comfort in the silence. "It'll get easier, Em," he said softly. "I promise." Emma nodded, her eyes filling with unshed tears as she rested her head on his shoulder. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. She wasn't alone, and that meant more than anything. The weight of the day's events hung heavily in the air. Emma sat on the couch, her thoughts swirling in a blur. She had tried to distract herself with tea, but it only helped to calm her nerves slightly. The adrenaline from the confrontation earlier had begun to wear off, leaving her with a quiet unease that she couldn't quite shake. Jack had gone to the kitchen to prepare dinner, but he hadn't pressured her to join him. The world around them felt both ordinary and surreal, like everything was back to normal, but Emma knew that it wasn't. She would never look at a cafe or an afternoon out the same way again. The thought of what could have happened if her father hadn't been there, hadn't intervened, was a constant undercurrent in her mind. The sound of sirens suddenly filled the air, cutting through the quiet evening. Emma froze, her pulse quickening for a split second. It was the sirens from earlier, echoing through the neighborhood, signaling that the police had completed their sweep and were now wrapping up their investigation. Jack looked up from the kitchen, his face unreadable as the sound grew louder. He had been quiet since they returned home, the weight of the events clearly still on his mind. He didn't say anything, just nodded toward the door. "They'll be here soon," Jack murmured, his voice steady but filled with a kind of quiet anticipation. It was the same tone he'd used when preparing for something big, something he had no control over. Emma nodded, but she could feel her heart rate increase. She had no idea what to expect next, but it was hard to shake the feeling that everything was far from over. A knock at the door startled them both, and Emma jumped slightly in her seat. Jack moved toward the door without hesitation, his calm demeanor never wavering as he opened it. Two uniformed officers stood outside, their expressions professional but not unfriendly. One was a woman, her dark hair pulled back in a tight ponytail, and the other was a tall man with a stern expression, his gaze immediately scanning the room as if assessing the situation. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she recognized them both from earlier. The officers who had been the first on the scene, the ones who had taken charge after the confrontation outside the cafe. "Mr. Davis?" the woman asked, her tone polite, but with an edge of authority. "We need to ask you a few questions about what happened this afternoon." Jack nodded, stepping aside to let them in. "Of course," he replied evenly, his gaze briefly flickering to Emma. She could see the protective glint in his eyes, but there was also a measure of calm, as if he had done this 100 times before. As the officers stepped inside, Emma stood up slowly, unsure of what to expect. The tall officer, whose name she still didn't know, glanced at her as she moved toward the kitchen. She felt his gaze linger on her for a moment before he turned back to Jack. "We've got the 3 men in custody," the female officer continued, her voice carrying the weight of the situation. "They're not talking much yet, but we'll have more answers soon." Jack nodded but didn't speak. Emma could sense that her father was keeping a lot of things to himself. He had always been a man of few words, especially when it came to matters of work, of duty. But there was something different in the air now, something unspoken between them. The officers continued speaking, but Emma found it hard to focus on their words. She was still processing the chaos from earlier, still reeling from the fact that 3 strangers had tried to rob her in broad daylight. The world she had known, the city she had trusted, had suddenly seemed less safe. The tall officer turned toward Emma, his gaze now more direct. "We're going to need you to come down to the station tomorrow to give a full statement," he said, his voice businesslike but not unkind. We need to know exactly what happened, in your own words. Emma nodded automatically, her mouth dry. Of course, she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Her heart still beat unevenly in her chest, and she felt a sense of unease as she thought about having to recount everything that had happened. The confrontation, the fear, the helplessness she had felt. It was all still so raw, but she couldn't avoid it. She had to face it, if only to help the authorities bring those men to justice. We'll be in touch, the female officer said, giving a small nod before turning toward the door. But for now, you're free to go. Stay safe, okay? Emma barely heard the last part of her words as she watched the officers leave. The door clicked shut behind them, and the house was quiet once more. Jack stood still for a moment, his gaze distant. He wasn't looking at her, but Emma could sense the tension in his posture. He had been the one to deal with the physical confrontation, the one who had protected her when she hadn't been able to protect herself. But now, as the reality of what had happened began to sink in, Emma knew her father was thinking about everything that still had to be done, about the consequences of this day. Emma walked toward the window, staring out at the street below. The police cars had driven off, the flashing lights now a distant memory. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, yet nothing felt the same. Jack joined her by the window, his expression calm but serious. He didn't need to say anything. She could read it in the set of his jaw, the slight furrow of his brow. He was still processing the events just like her, but now with the immediate danger past, there was a quiet determination in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. I should have been more careful, Emma murmured, more to herself than to him. I should have noticed them sooner. Jack shook his head, his voice firm. You did nothing wrong, Emma. This wasn't your fault. You were just sitting there minding your own business. You didn't ask for any of this. But you're safe now. And that's what matters. Emma turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. She saw the truth in his words, but there was a lingering fear deep inside her, a fear she hadn't fully confronted yet. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, Dad. Jack placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. You will, he said quietly. It takes time, but you'll find that sense of security again. I'll make sure of it. Emma nodded slowly, but even as she did, the weight of everything hung heavy in the room. The men who had attacked her would face consequences, but Emma knew deep down that the road to healing would be longer than just a night at home. It would take time, and she wasn't sure when things would feel normal again. For now, though, she had her father by her side, and that, she realized, was enough to begin the long road toward recovery. The night stretched on, but Emma found herself unable to sleep. The weight of the day's events pressed down on her chest, an ever-present reminder of the fear she had experienced and the near miss with danger. Despite the calm that had settled in their home, her mind refused to quiet. The images of the confrontation, the feel of the men's eyes on her, the sounds of her father's swift, calculated movements. Everything was still vivid in her mind, playing on repeat like an unsettling soundtrack. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her phone, but not really seeing it. She could hear the soft hum of the house around her, the quiet sound of her father moving downstairs, perhaps preparing for the day ahead. Jack's ability to compartmentalize, to push forward without hesitation, was something Emma had always admired about him. But tonight, she couldn't help but wonder if he was struggling too. The confrontation had been over in a matter of minutes, but it had left an indelible mark on both of them. The rawness of the fear she had felt, the vulnerability of being attacked in a place she thought was safe, was something Emma didn't know how to shake. It wasn't just about the purse or the bracelet. It was the feeling of being powerless, of not having control over the situation. Her father had been there, had stepped in and made sure she was safe. But she couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he hadn't been there. Would she have been able to fight back? Could she have gotten away? A soft knock on the door snapped her out of her thoughts. Emma! Jack's voice was low, steady. She had always found comfort in the way he said her name. There was always an assurance there, something that made her feel like everything would be okay, no matter what. Yeah, Emma replied, her voice quieter than she intended. She wiped a hand across her face, suddenly feeling the weight of the emotions she had been trying to push away. Jack opened the door just a crack, his tall frame filling the doorway. His eyes met hers, soft but full of understanding. "Can I come in?" he asked, his tone still calm, though there was something there, something unspoken. Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Of course." Jack stepped inside, closing the door softly behind him. He moved over to the chair by her desk, sitting down, his posture relaxed but alert. "You doing okay?" he asked, his gaze never leaving her face. There was no hurry in his words, no pressure. He was simply offering her space to talk, if she wanted to. Emma hesitated, unsure of where to begin. She had been trying to convince herself that everything would be fine, that the danger had passed, but it felt too soon, too raw. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice cracking slightly. "I thought I could handle it, but I feel like I can't breathe sometimes, like something's still hanging over me. I keep seeing it, the way they looked at me, the way you handled them. It's like it's all stuck in my head, and I can't get it out." Jack's expression softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "That's okay, Emma. It's normal. What you went through wasn't easy, and it's going to take some time for you to process everything. It's not something you just shake off." Emma nodded, her fingers tightening around the blanket she was clutching. "I keep thinking about what could have happened. What if you hadn't been there? What if—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "I don't even want to think about it." Jack didn't interrupt her, letting her words hang in the air. He knew how difficult it was for Emma to express what she was feeling. She had always been strong, always the one to keep things together, but he knew that the fear she had experienced today wasn't something that could be easily swept away. "You're allowed to be scared," Jack said quietly. "You don't have to be strong all the time. It's okay to feel how you feel. What happened today was real and it shook you up. And that's all right. It's normal to question what happened and wonder what might have been. But you're safe now, Emma, and that's what matters most." The way Jack spoke, with such certainty, brought Emma a small measure of comfort. She knew he was right, but the truth was, she wasn't sure if she would ever feel safe again. Not the way she had before. She had been tested in a way she never had been, and it had changed her. It had opened her eyes to how fragile things could be, how quickly life could change. One moment she was sipping her coffee, the next her world had been turned upside down. Jack continued, his voice gentle but firm. "This is what I want you to understand, Emma. You are not powerless. You are not a victim. You've been through something horrible, but that doesn't define you. It doesn't change who you are. You're stronger than you think, and you've got a whole lot of fight in you. It may take some time to feel like yourself again, but you'll get there, and you won't be alone when you do." Emma felt the weight of his words settle into her chest. She knew he was right, even if she didn't fully believe it yet. She had been through something traumatic, something that would take time to heal. But her father's presence, his unwavering belief in her, was something she could hold on to. It was something to fight for. "Thanks, Dad," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. She wiped a tear from her cheek, not realizing it had fallen. Jack stood up, moving to her side. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "No need to thank me. Just know that I'm here no matter what, and we'll get through this, together." Emma nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek despite herself. She had always known that her father would be there when she needed him, but hearing him say it out loud, hearing the sincerity in his voice, made her realize how lucky she was. For so long, she had taken it for granted, thinking she was invincible, that nothing could shake her, but today had shown her just how fragile life could be. "Together," she repeated softly. Jack smiled, his eyes warm with pride. "Always." And for the first time that night, Emma felt the tightness in her chest begin to loosen. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She wasn't sure how long it would take to heal, how long it would take to feel whole again, but she knew one thing for certain. With her father by her side, she could face whatever came next. The following days passed in a blur for Emma. The police had completed their investigation, and the three men, Connor, Ryan, and Paul, were all facing charges for their attempted robbery and the other crimes they had committed. Emma had given her statement to the police, recounting everything that had happened in the cafe, from the moment she noticed them until the intervention of her father. The process had been exhausting, but she did it. She faced what had happened and was ready to move forward. Yet despite everything being handled by the authorities, Emma couldn't escape the feeling of unease that lingered. There were moments when she would be walking down the street only for a passing person to catch her eye, and she'd feel her heart rate spike. Or when she entered a cafe or a public space, a sense of alertness would fill her chest. The peace she had once taken for granted was now something she had to rebuild, piece by piece. But Emma was determined. With her father by her side, she knew she would find her way back. She wasn't the same person she had been before, but perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. Life had changed her. It had made her more aware of the fragility of the world around her, and she realized that she could never take her safety, or the safety of those she loved, for granted again. Jack, ever the steady presence, had been with her every step of the way. He had guided her through the process, never pushing her, but always there when she needed him. He had been the rock she had clung to, and as the days wore on, Emma found herself growing stronger, inch by inch. She wasn't just recovering from what had happened. She was learning from it. The scars would take time to fade, but they would fade, just as all things do in time, and Emma had no doubt that eventually she would feel like herself again. Weeks passed, and the legal process moved forward. The trial for Connor, Ryan, and Paul was set in motion, and Emma had to return to the courthouse to testify. It wasn't easy. Every time she stepped into that courtroom, she was confronted with the fear and anxiety she had felt during the confrontation. The sounds of the court, the sterile atmosphere, the glares from the defendants, everything took her back to that moment. But this time, she wasn't alone. Jack was right there beside her, supporting her, offering her quiet encouragement whenever she needed it. She realized that this trial wasn't just about justice for her, it was about sending a message. It was about proving that no one could get away with threatening her or anyone else without consequences. Connor and his friends were eventually convicted. Their actions, their attempts to rob and intimidate Emma, would not be overlooked. The law had caught up with them, and they would face the consequences for their crimes. Emma felt a strange sense of closure as the judge handed down the sentences, though the reality was that nothing could truly erase what had happened. It was a small victory. The justice she had hoped for had been served. With the trial behind her, Emma slowly started to rebuild her life. She returned to her job, though it took time to feel normal again. Her co-workers had been understanding, giving her the space she needed to heal. Her friends, too, were supportive, checking in on her and offering a listening ear when she needed it most. As for her relationship with Jack, it had only grown stronger. Their bond, forged through years of shared experiences, had been tested, and Emma knew that no matter what came next, her father would always be there for her. One morning, as the sun rose over the city, Emma found herself standing by the window, looking out at the world that had seemed so different just a few weeks ago. The streets were bustling with life, people moving about their business, oblivious to the storm that had passed through her life. The world continued to turn, despite everything. But she was different now, more aware, more cautious, more grateful. Jack appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He gave her a small smile as he walked over to the table, placing one of the mugs in front of her. "Morning," he said simply. Emma smiled faintly, taking the cup from him and savoring the warmth. "Morning, Dad." Jack sat down across from her, his eyes never leaving her face. For a moment, the world outside seemed to fade, and all that mattered was the quiet peace they shared. The two of them had been through something together, something that would forever shape who they were. But as Emma looked at her father, she realized that they had come out stronger for it. "How are you feeling?" Jack asked gently, his gaze filled with the kind of care that Emma had always relied on. Emma looked at him, taking a deep breath before she answered. "I'm doing better," she said quietly. "Not everything is back to normal yet, but I'm getting there, and I'll get through it. We will." Jack nodded, his lips curling into a small but proud smile. "I knew you would." As they sat together sipping their coffee, Emma felt the last traces of fear begin to fade. It wasn't gone completely, but it was no longer as overwhelming. The scars would always be there, reminders of the battle she had fought, but they would not define her. Her father had taught her that, and in the end, that was the most important lesson of all. Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, Emma's life began to feel more like it once had. The world was not as predictable as it had seemed before, but perhaps that made it more precious. She had learned the importance of embracing the uncertain, of fighting through the fear, and of trusting the people who loved her. And as for Jack, he remained her constant, her protector, her guide, and the man she would always turn to when the world felt too big. He had shown her once again that no matter what life threw at them, they could face it together. With each passing day, Emma grew stronger. And with each passing day, the world seemed a little bit safer, a little bit brighter. And as she moved forward, Emma knew one thing for certain. She would never take her safety or her family for granted again. Life was fragile, but it was also beautiful, and she was ready to live it fully, with the love and strength of her father by her side.